Okay, welcome back. We're still talking about automation steps and how you can start small. They even talk about the goal one more time is for this, self-service automate OS install. I mean, okay, that's not something I think it would be a very good idea, but hey. So moving on page 152, they talk about when not to automate. Well, if you got something that's oddball, one-off, or perhaps it's just too costly to do, well then, okay, don't bother. All right, this is not tough. I mean, if you only have one of these Linux boxes and you're never ever going to get another one, well, you probably don't need a complete automated system. Maybe just do a good backup, like the image backup thing I was talking about, where if it died or you need to replace the hardware, you just do a restore and move on, right? Okay. So perhaps the if you had a checklist that you were using in a manual scenario, if one day they said, well, we're going to put in more Linux boxes, at least you'd have a checklist on when you installed it the first time, on so how you could use that as a basis for doing automation sometime in the future. Okay, vendor support on page 152. In the old days, there were some people who would send out, you had to have some sort of like a magic installer to be able to install the software. Now, almost all companies will provide what's called an MSI file. I mean, you could get an EXE installer, you could, but most vendors of commercial software will allow you to get an MSI file or maybe a PKG file, particularly if it's a Linux or something. But an MSI file means I would take this file and it makes it easier for automation. It makes it easier for me to, remember I was talking about how you could have a base image and like for the accounting group, you would add the accounting software. If it was an MSI file, it makes it trivial for you to just add on to the base image. Okay. So let's talk about that. They showed an example on page 152 of an operating system that had to have the vendor to do the install. This is a crazy story, and thankfully it's like several years old, and hopefully this won't ever happen again. They had some sort of a custom Unix system, and one day they had to do a reload, and so they called up the company and said, hey man, could you give us the install files to re-image this machine? They went, oh no, we can't do that. You have to send us the hard drive. It's like, what? So what, send the hard drive to Japan, have them image it, and send it back? Gee, I think that's going to take a while. Okay, that's just dumb. I mean, clearly the vendor is the one who needed some sort of automated install process. Okay, now there are some tricks to this. I mean, remember I mentioned that if you use like a USB flash drive for Acronis, and you boot up off this Pixie boot, and it boots up into WinPE, and then I hook the network to be able to go get like off of some other machine or a server to be able to go get the backup image. Maybe the backups are stored on maybe a network attached storage box, a NAS box or something for your company. Well, wait a minute now. That flash drive is going to have the WinPE image is going to have drivers for your network, right? On the thing, because you can't use the network to go get the network drives, right? Okay, so it's a catch-22. So most companies will either preload tons and tons and tons of these critical device drivers for 100 different types of network cards, or in the case of Acronis, if the store-bought one doesn't work, then they have a little procedure you follow where you can just add on whatever network drivers you want, push the button, and it'll produce a custom one. I had to do that. I had to create a custom one because I had one particular motherboard that had a built-in network card that wasn't on the list, and therefore it wouldn't work. So, no big deal. Just had to go through a couple more steps. Okay, so Microsoft is doing an awful lot better than this. There's an awful lot of standard drivers that already appear in the Microsoft media. Okay, most of the time, I rarely now have a problem installing particularly Windows 11. You can put Windows 11 on practically anything now, and I'm pretty much for sure it's going to detect your network card and your VGA card and all the rest of that stuff. Okay, so on page 154, they talk about just use the vendor's installation, right? Buy me a Dell machine and it comes preloaded. So in theory, if you were to say I want no OS whatsoever, the cost should be a tiny bit less, right, when you order it with no operating system. In theory, in reality, they're a volume license thing, and so it'll probably be like $10 or something. I mean, it's not much. So, but if it does come with it, you probably should just dump it and reload. Using your licenses, for your machine, not the OEM licenses, right? Just dump theirs and start over. And I mentioned that the Army is big enough that the Army basically says, here's the Army Gold Master, and so if you're going to be doing business with us, you're going to need to be able to put our image on your machine. So that's pretty doggone cool. And then not in the book. So you guys, maintenance of the image. Let's say you have that cloning thing. So when you do Patch Tuesday, every Patch Tuesday you get a new set of updates. Well, do you update your image? I mean, I guess you could, but the way to do this would be to automate this, right? So you have it's called a WIM file. Don't worry about that. We haven't talked about it. So I have a WIM file, which is basically my automated install. There's a technique that you can use that when Patch Tuesday comes around and they produce all these patches, you can just apply the patch to the image. And so the next time you use the image, it'll already be up to date. Because how bad would it be? Well, it's not terrible. But you get a brand new image and you boot it up and the first thing it says is, wait, I need to go get 42 different updates that have happened since the last time you did this image. It's like, geez. So maintaining the image is kind of something you need to know about. So Patch Tuesday and how to update the WIM file. Another way of doing this is, let's say you had a virtual machine, which was your master machine. And you wanted to try things out on this thing to make sure, that the patches work, and you want to make sure all the software settings are right. You could do this thing called a snapshot. Virtual machine has this thing called snapshot where it'll just make a copy of it. And then you could run this thing called sysprep, which creates that image ready to be applied. But the problem is, after you sysprep something, it's difficult to get back to where you were. So that's what these little snapshots are. And I know I'm speaking Greek, but when we get to that part, it'll make a little bit more sense. Okay, we've reached the end of this chapter, and stay tuned for the next chapter.